Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Bouncing Around that is covering the playoffs. Yes, the NBA playoffs are here. We're going to talk about them. I'm Samson Folk, otherwise known as Jim from Treasure Planet. That is Evin Gualberto over there. This is his channel that he's crafted, I think, over hundreds of years. It's outlasted the Roman Empire. Will certainly outlast the American one. And blood, sweat, and tears. You know how it sounds. You know what it is. We're here to talk basketball. Evin, are you ready? Truly, the bounce around. The playoffs, Evin. We're here to talk about them, as I said in the intro. How are you feeling today?
Feeling good, feeling spry, surprised by how a bunch of series have gone, but we'll get into that. So, how are you?
Surprised. Spry and surprised, I would say. And surprised by a couple series, most notably the Lakers and the Suns. The surprising aspect is that Chris Paul got injured. It's extremely disappointing. Also, the Clippers and the Mavericks, I think, has been a very surprising series. Three-point shooting variance is a hell of a thing, and the Clippers find themselves on the extremely wrong side of it. And for a team that enjoys jump shots as much as they do, not great. Not great at all. But most importantly, you're spry, you're surprised. Is there anything you want to talk about before we get into our lightning round of other NBA stuff?
No, let's jump in because you've got some stuff at the ready. I have some stuff later, play breakdowns. We're both excited about it, and we've already announced it. We have a thing later. We'll talk about that thing later.
Okay, so I'll tee it up. The thing he's doing later is with Bowser to Bowser. They'll be breaking down Hawks and Knicks. Evan will be here talking through my series, the Jazz and the Grizzlies, with me. What we're doing now is a lightning round of takeaways from the rest of the series so we can focus more concretely on the other ones. So first thing, Boston and the Nets. I understand that it might be rewarding to dive into every fun possession that happens, the overwhelming force that James Harden, Kevin Durant, and Kyrie Irving play with, that opens up looks for the likes of Blake Griffin, Joe Harris, and just an incredible supporting cast, an overwhelming team. KD got a post-entry pass in pseudo transition. They just had to double right away, and he just dropped the ball off to James Harden. They got 3 points. I'm not sure that basketball is supposed to be that easy, although they've secured a spot for themselves to get baskets that easy, and not just in that occasion, but on many occasions. And the Celtics currently are not the team to press them to the breaking point. The good thing, though, with the Celtics is that Robert Williams, Time Lord, as he's affectionately called, may be #the guy. Italics, bold, whatever you want to add to it, the guy. I thought it was silly that they gave up on Tice, especially since the Bulls, I think the Bulls probably saw what Tice's value was. Tice, it might have been interesting to see if the Celtics had really gotten it together in last year's Eastern Conference Finals. I think that Tice makes sense as the big man on a winning team, like a contender, if the Celtics do have the size that Hayward used to bring to their starting lineup. So Tatum, Hayward, Brown, you can kind of get away with Tice being undersized to the position, really smart mover, really tenacious defender, and you can get away with that if the rest of your lineup is really big. It didn't work out last year. I thought it was silly to give up on him this year, but maybe they didn't see themselves as contenders. Either way, they're in the playoffs. Robert Williams, he's not starting, but he's coming off of the bench and looks like a guy, especially offensively, defensively, bringing lots, especially in comparison to Tristan Thompson, who had maybe the best quote. He's like, if you spit on me, I'm going to follow you to your house. Incredible quote. But he's been much better than Tristan. Williams looks like a guy that the Celtics can bank on headed into the future. And obviously they know with Brown and Tatum, those two are their guys. Adding a third guy into the mix who is of not the same level, but a high enough level that you can work with, super meaningful, very big deal. That's my takeaway from Celtics and Nets, other than the Nets just being incredible.
Not a whole lot to add because I'm sure everybody's talked about this at this point. You would have loved to have seen this series with both rosters fully healthy. The Jaylen Brown factor, huge. The thing I want to talk about is Joe Harris. Joe Harris, not just a shooter. I've been working on a video. What I really wanted to do was highlight his ability to unlock things as a screener and how they use him in ghost action and stuff like that. But it's harder to find than you would think, because screen assists, sure, but ghost screen assists, not a thing. So still working on that. But he's somebody I wanted to highlight, especially because he's somebody who went off in game 2, not just spotting up or spacing the floor, being active defensively, engaging. And what I've noticed as I go through the video is he's actively looking for contact. He seeks out contact on those cuts, especially on the screens, but on those cuts. And when he catches the ball deep, he'll bump a big low and then go up to finish. And that's not stuff that people should take for granted, because if Joe Harris was just a shooter, the Nets would still be able to have tremendous success. But his value in so many different facets, it's a big 4 as far as I'm concerned, because of the ability he has on offense.
We talked about that ever since Harden joined, and I did my famous Chris Vernon impression because Chris Vernon thought that they had phased out Joe Harris for whatever reason. He thought that Joe Harris had now been no longer a factor on that Nets team, which I think will prove a very incorrect statement the longer these playoffs go on. And Harris he slides in perfectly, and especially that he's willing to make utility of himself, not just as a shooter, but with the full weight of his gravity and everything that goes on with that. I'm excited for the Nets to be tested, to see how they respond to a little bit more pressure, both as an offense and as a defense, because that's really where you see how these teams handle that kind of stuff. So that's very interesting. Okay, Lakers, I'm really interested in LeBron's rim frequency. It is famously low right now. And I think a lot of people have been tracking this relative to all of his other playoff series. That's something to track. The Suns, are they doing a really good job of keeping him away from the rim? Has DeAndre Ayton done a much better job of being big around the rim and kind of showcasing his presence? Are dig downs a worry for everybody from that team? Totally, yes. But it's still somewhat within his control, and he hasn't been stepping into that mode yet. Montrezl Harrell, he hits the pine. Gasol is taking those minutes from him. We've seen this in past playoffs. Harrell was a guy who did not get to play a bunch down the stretch of last season, and the Clippers were very much disappointed in what he was able to bring, especially that he doesn't bring a lot outside of a rolling threat. And if you wanted him to have the ball late shot clock, end of game, and he has to do a dribble handoff or something, you don't feel that confident. Not to mention defensively, he's not giving you a bunch. Rebounding either. Yeah, I know that's like his calling card, but it's not a super strong aspect of his game at this point. So Gasol instead, a guy who's going to make great reads defensively. If you want to go to our Spain pick and roll episode, you can see Gasol making great reads, a team that runs a ton of Spain pick and roll, the Suns. It's cool in this series to see the Suns running actions out of the Spain pick and roll to counter how the Lakers are playing, pin downs off of it, flares off of it. It's all very clever, all very cool. I like that a lot. And Kuzma. I think Kuzma just deserves a lot of love for his well-rounded play. He's no longer the guy who's he either comes in, he's going to take 7 threes, and if you get 3 or 4 of them to hit during the game, you wash your hands and say, good Kuzma game. Maybe he has a good back cut. Maybe he's out in transition a couple times. Now, with his size and awareness and willingness to play defense at the level, he's providing a lot more than he initially was expected to. And that means that even through his offensive droughts, which are fewer and fewer because of his ability to utilize himself in the half court with intelligent cutting, kudos to Kuzma for bringing a lot more to his game.
Yeah. And on the other side, Jay Crowder, Mikal Bridges, they bring so much defensively. You can go back and check out our Suns episode on that. I'll link to everything is linked below. Jay Crowder is 7 for 27 from the field, and Mikal Bridges 8 for 23. Like I said, defensively, they bring so much value. You more or less have to have them on the floor. They're not killing you with their decision making either. It's just that they're not making shots. Now, Is there a regression to the mean coming? Or, as others have pointed out, is this Jay Crowder regressing to the mean? Because the volume that he's taking these shots, they were going down. They're not now. For Bridges, hard to say if this is what we are going to expect going forward, because the attempts have gone down each game. Is that the Lakers locking in? Is that them taking away his first look and then he decides that it's better to pass than try to make a play? 12 attempts in the first game, 6 in the second. Last game, 5. It's not necessarily something to go crazy looking into, but if the battle is won by the Lakers' wings, then it's no longer Chris Paul and Devin Booker because of the injury, and that sucks. We were robbed of what likely would have been a barn burner of a series. Weird phrase, barn burner, but whatever. It's DeAndre Ayton versus Drummond, Gasol in spot minutes, and Davis. Ayton was really, again, I talked about this in the Knicks episode, Suns-Knicks. Ayton being able to, and this was your point specifically, being able to take on a smaller role and excel in that role and over-deliver instead of wanting more shot attempts, et cetera, the trappings of young stars. That has been big. I talked in that episode, his ability to guard Giannis, his ability to dominate the floor like he did in Game 1, and in stretches. Game 3, he was solid from the field. It's just, there has to be a tipping point in the Suns' favor, because if Ayton's bringing this every night, Booker, and it's not obviously, the Lakers have game planned for Booker and have basically schemed out Chris Paul by virtue of his injury. I messaged you about this off pod. Dare Chris Paul to beat you, because his shoulder's messed up, his shooting form, he's had to alter it. Dare Chris Paul to beat you. Now it's all about shutting down Devin Booker. There is a path to the Suns winning, but it runs through Ayton and Booker. And something I wanted to touch on is Dennis Schröder. Last season, I would say it was really important for Dennis Schröder. We talk about this a lot with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, but Schröder being under Chris Paul's wing for a full season and now having to guard him in a playoff series, this is where it's paying dividends. It may not in any other series, but this is the series the Lakers are really thankful that Schröder was with Chris Paul for an entire season.
One of the things I do like about Schröder has been his sense of the moment. Again, this is hyperbolic stuff, but if you look at how the Thunder played with their 3-guard unit of Shai, Chris Paul, and Schröder was always a really big part of that and one of the most successful units in the league at that point in time. And it's because of his ability to just plug in and score. I can't remember who made this comparison, but they said Kyrie light. And I even saying light Kyrie is maybe going too far for Schröder, but his ability to plug in next to LeBron and provide scoring punch and ball handling probably is one of the more important things on the Lakers roster. He's been really good. As far as the roadmap to victory, I don't see it, and maybe you were just being polite, but I don't see it for the Suns. I think losing Chris Paul, and not losing him all the way, but to punch up against these Lakers, even though they're the higher seed, requires really, you have to punch above your weight at a few different positions. Cam Johnson, Jay Crowder, Mikal Bridges, those guys are combining for, I think, 31% from the floor. If you're not going to get, like, if that's what you're getting from your wings, and Chris Paul isn't giving you that great elbow offense, that you have the release valve, it means that a lot more of Chris Paul's would-be shots are being funneled to those guys who aren't capably putting the ball on the floor and beating the second line of defense. Something Mikal Bridges will probably reliably pick up, and Cam Johnson, I wouldn't be surprised if he does that as they progress in their career. But currently, not enough ammunition, not enough weapons against the Lakers. And the Lakers are very in tune to that fact and playing into it. I think the Suns, a team that probably would have been my odds-on favorite to come out of the West prior to the playoffs, I really liked them. Losing Chris Paul cuts away so much of the utility that their utility knife offense provided. And losing him, he's a fulcrum. And Devin Booker was probably the best player on the team. I didn't get the Chris Paul MVP hype to the full degree that other people did, but Chris Paul, even the fact that he's mentioned in those conversations, should speak volumes about how much the Suns are missing here without him having, a fulcrum of his game in the ability to work in the middle of the floor and produce offense when things slow down.
So, guy, we have talked about a lot. Fish with Gun, specifically. Cam Payne. Cam Payne has, like I talked about with Aiden, over-delivered in his role. But the problem with that is if Cam Payne is your best point guard or the one who's producing the most out of your point guard rotation, you can only go so high. Yes, I was being polite with the Suns because, like, I texted you about this off pod. If the next game, if Chris Paul is struggling, why not Tony Allen him? Make him beat you. If he's going to make shots, have him make shots, but it's going to be at great cost to him. And maybe Chris Paul has a game or two like that in him, but it's not a sustainable game plan. And that's why LeBron, the rim frequency, you talked about this, and I know this was an earlier point, but it looks to me, based on, having watched LeBron his entire career pretty much, he's working his way back to being 100% because he's definitely not there. And this is just about everywhere. It's by no means a new take by me, is he has mastered the art of resting in possessions in games, not having to sit out, but on the floor, maximizing, conserving energy. I think that's what's happening here. Because if Anthony Davis is going to deliver the performances he delivered in game 2 and 3, and you can get good Drummond and you can get solid minutes from Gasol, which, yeah. Caruso, defensively, he's been a bother. KCP, I talked about this in a long time ago. Friend of the pod, Louis Zatzman, he commended my point of, like, if KCP is going to KCP, then there's nothing you can really do for the Lakers. And KCP hasn't really KCP'd yet. So there are so many more things that could go right for the Lakers. And if so many more things go right for the Suns, there's a hard cap to that. And it is unfortunate that that's happened. But I'm with you. Before the Lakers matchup, like right before the Lakers matchup, I said, I feel like maybe there's I don't make predictions, but if you asked me to, whoever came out of Suns Lakers would be my favorite to come out of the West. That's how much I believed in the Suns. And, we're robbed of that. So.
Okay. Clippers, Mavs, you don't have to switch indiscriminately. This is something I would say the Rockets, the way they defended the Warriors, they really brought in kind of this thing where it's like you just switch. And the guys walk up and they switch before the screen is even set. And it's a nicety to even bring the screener up because everyone knows they're just going to switch. It's rote, it's whatever. Teams do that now when they don't have to. And is there an expectation that it's just, well, if you fight over the screen, get there, you're just going to rescreen. And you're going to rescreen. You're just going to waste defensive energy? I guess so. But you're also spending time on the shot clock, which I don't hear talked about a lot outside of like coaching circles, but is an extremely important thing to do defensively. If you can, and here's the thing, like if you work into the secondary level or the second side action, if you work into that without creating an advantage, that's a huge deal for the defense because it means you took away the original and they have less time on the clock. If you're able to keep them on their primary deep into the shot clock, you're winning because they can't do it every single time. Switching indiscriminately, I'm not sure what that creates for you sometimes because sometimes teams are just surrendering a mismatch without fighting to keep it away. And that is something that I think is really interesting about the Clippers-Mavericks series, particularly with Luka. Everybody is talking about and making jokes because Rajon Rondo, quote unquote, is calling out the Mavericks plays. And everybody's like, oh, he's calling out a Luka ISO or a Luka pick and roll. Genius, Rondo. Very clever of you to figure it out. But there's obviously more to it, of course. And yeah, it's funny that Rick Carlisle mentioned that. But anyway, I think that's funny. And also, I don't think the Clippers are out of it. There's a huge 3-point disparity thing going on in that series. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Clippers won in 6. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if they took 4 straight. The supporting cast of the Mavericks, particularly Dorian Finney-Smith, Tim Hardaway Jr., awesome, really good. But if too much of those possessions, and Jalen Brunson as well, Jalen Brunson, who they didn't have last year, who is also very good. But if the ball falls into Kristaps' hands too much, or the Clippers can find a way to funnel the ball to somebody they're more comfortable with, and he doesn't come through, they could get back into this very quickly, I think, and with like a real hammer stroke in Game 3, potentially. Now, Game 3 is being played later today and before this episode comes out, so I could sound like a real dummy. But that's my thoughts on that series.
I'll jump in with you. Yeah. If you look at it from all of the unimportant stuff, the narrative stuff, the Mavs have the momentum. Yes, obviously. They have Luka. Yes. But what happened in Game 2 is Paul George and Kawhi Leonard carried the offensive load, the level of which everyone, I think, was expecting of them when these two paired up. Did anybody else come through? In moments, sure. But not to the level that they did. Defensively, they have a lot to clean up. Kawhi Leonard, Serge Ibaka, Ty Lue. Who else can I name? They have Rajon Rondo. Championship DNA. They have that. They know what it's like to be in the heat of the moment and be able to turn things around. Ty Lue, down 3-1 to the Warriors. Kawhi and Serge down 2-0 to the Bucks in the Eastern Conference Finals. And Game 3 went to overtime. So, if you're counting out the Clippers, okay, I understand. If it's a mindset thing, whatever. But I'm telling you, whatever the result of Game 3 was, by the time you're listening to this, it's not an impossible thing that had a couple of shots gone down differently, we could be looking at a completely different series. Obviously, that's a super, super obvious point. I'm aware. But what I'm saying is that it's not for a lack of Paul George and Kawhi Leonard bringing it. It's not for a lack of Rajon Rondo doing his very best to say, hey, I know everything they're going to run. Have some belief that we're going to stop it. His play recognition, out of this world. So it's one thing, we were talking about this too, is if you're game planning against the Mavs, it's either make everybody else beat you, but Luke is such a good passer. He probably can manufacture buckets and get his teammates involved. If your game plan is to just have Luka beat you, he was kind of doing that. But the fact that every single Maverick is hitting pull-up jumpers and the Clippers can't hit their catch-and-shoot threes, that means a lot. That means a lot. And I guess that's all I have to say about that because, we don't know how Game 3 turned out.
It's also interesting because Luka is one of the preeminent offensive forces in the NBA. And this is somebody who Paul George and Kawhi Leonard in their primes defensively, which don't always exist on the same timeline as offensive primes, they're somebody who would be thrown at quite liberally. And are they at the same level where they can just pick him up and affect him as much as they maybe would have earlier in their career? No. And they're also at the point in their career where their regular season defense won't match up their defense when they care. They're not proving anything anymore. They also have higher offensive workloads. So where really is their defense? You can only really tell when the playoffs come around. And has it taken a step down to some degree? Perhaps. So that's an interesting thing to keep an eye on going forward, if the series does get good, for lack of a better term, I would say. Okay, Philly Wizards, Embiid, one of the best celebrations of all time. This is something he's been doing for a little bit, and it's great. Big fan of it. Evin knows how much I love Joel Embiid. I think he's fantastic. The horn sets are still very valuable and successful for the 76ers. They seem like a shoe-in for the conference finals. They're a very good team. They run their stuff to their advantage. They have been hitting those advantages. They're doing a good job of it. Daniel Oligner on Twitter highlighted the back cut out of those horn sets, or what I thought looked like the horn sets, and it's been a really good connection for Ben Simmons to Tobias Harris. That's cool. It'll be linked. You can check that out. He takes, I think, like 2 minutes to walk through a bunch of those things. And so that's good. Big shout out, Daniel. And that's where I'm at for that series. It's not very interesting compared to a lot of other ones.
Tobias Harris was a problem in game one. Ben Simmons was a problem in game two. I have no doubt Joel Embiid will continue to be a problem until the Wizards go home. Daniel, you took away the thing I thought was going to be an insightful thing to highlight. Props to you. I'm not mad about it at all. We have more time to talk about the Sixers because the intrigue of Knicks Hawks is fun. It is. We're having Bowser to Bowser on later. It's going to be great to talk adjustments. But do I really think that one of these two teams has a shot against the 76ers? Sure. Yeah. A puncher's chance. If something goes wrong with one of their 3 stars, then sure. But not really. I don't expect very much drama in the way of the Sixers ending up in the conference finals. So we'll have more time to talk about the Sixers. If that's what you came here for, I'm sorry. If Wizards analysis is what you came here for, I'm very sorry for a number of reasons. Hope you understand.
Bucks Heat, we talked about this in the middle of the season a few times because we did a few Bucks games over the span of a month, I think. And something we highlighted was that this team is fundamentally different, even though the dialogue around the Bucks was still so much the same, that they're the same team with Budenholzer who doesn't want to play, he doesn't want to make adjustments, and Giannis has no bag, and Chris Middleton is just going to turn the ball over or something like that. That's never, ever going to be the case this year with Drew, Middleton, and Giannis. They have a very versatile offensive attack. They go to a bunch of different actions with different ball handlers. They get their guys in the right position to succeed all the time. And especially with Drew defensively, there's just this completely different point of attack than they've had. Bledsoe, God bless him, he's doing his thing. Well, not currently, but he did his thing, whatever you think that thing is, in New Orleans for this year. And the Bucks are much better off doing that trade. Giannis signed the extension. Drew, Giannis, Chris, with Brook, who is playing, I think, phenomenal drop defense currently. He's just walling off a huge portion of the rim in handfuls of possessions. That's really important. And grenade dribble handoffs for Bryn Forbes. Very fun. And for, any shooter who wants to sprint directly into the corner and shoot while gathering your balance and everything like that, it's phenomenal. So credit to the Bucks. The Heat, I think it's just tough. They've pressed on a lot of the weaknesses that the Heat currently have, and the Heat haven't been able to MacGyver their way out of the sticky spots, particularly with Goran Dragic and Bam Adebayo this year, I think. And Jimmy Butler showed it more so in the finals than any other series last year, but that willingness and that guile to get to the rim when it doesn't quite seem possible has been removed a little bit, especially from Dragic and Butler. And when you don't have that, the pitfalls of your offense, the weaknesses that every offense does have, they tend to come up. When you're not getting to the rim, when you don't have those easy baskets to bring up the floor of your offense, all the bad shots you take are magnified, and the team feels that too. And the Heat are kind of stuck in a rut, and the Bucks have done a wonderful job of putting them there.
I agree. There's not a whole lot to add, because here's my thing. I talked about this in one of the pods. It was at the end of a pod, and it was definitely not planned. But I talked about how Budenholzer is undervalued as a coach, because his unwillingness to bend, yeah, you can make fun of that all you want. But with the personnel that they have, and this was my point back then, with the personnel that they had, what could you really do? Are you really going to be a great switching team when you have the likes of Eric Bledsoe and Brook Lopez in your best defensive lineup? That doesn't work. You add PJ Tucker to that. Yeah, Mr. Switch. Drew Holiday, you talked about it. There's no need to talk about it. I love Drew. We all do. You should. Switching indiscriminately is not something they do. They switch very specific matchups. Brook is in drop. Drew and Chris, they can switch. Giannis on Jimmy Butler has been the adjustment that, if you were a Bucks fan, it's what you're clamoring for. Great. But that works because of the personnel around Giannis. He can take that matchup. Is he good at navigating screens? No. But the thing about it is that Bud has maximized every strength that the Bucks have. He's pressed all the right buttons. If this really is the matchup that they wanted, power to them, because you're exercising the ghosts of your past in order to be able to move forward. And this is as tough a test in the first round as I think any team has had to deal with. If you look at it from this is what they did to us last season, and they were in the finals, that's a high bar. And so iron sharpens iron. And this is something you want as a measuring stick early in the playoffs. Are you a legitimate contender? Because you've spent all year preparing for this matchup. Now you have it. They're showing what they can do. Game 1 came down to the wire, but you pulled through. You want those moments because they are tight, they are tough, and that's what you need. I think about the 2011 Mavs, that first round series against the Blazers, where Brandon Roy had that one comeback game. That was a huge test for them in the first round. And to be able to build off of that, if you listen to the Low Post, David Thorpe stole what would have been my point. He didn't steal it. He's smarter than me. It's fine. The Spurs buzzsawed through the entire playoffs after that first round series against the Mavs in 2014, that 7-game series. And what you need is that test. And now you know you can do it. And here the Bucks are.
Proverbs 27:17. Iron sharpens iron. Okay, but so let's get to my game, my series of the week, question mark. Okay, so Grizzlies, Jazz, it's 1-1. They play tomorrow, so this episode ideally will be out before that. And hopefully I'll touch on some things that are relevant, and I expect I will. So Jonas, Kyle Anderson, Dylan Brooks, and John Morant, that foursome has a net rating of positive 27.5 against the Jazz in this series. It's only 2 games. The theater incorporates a small sample size, let's say, of course, but they are mashing. And a big part of that is John Morant's ability to wiggle in the lane, use his floater. I mean, he scored 47 against that Jazz defense, and he did a lot of it headed downhill. Rudy Gobert is not somebody who is lucked into or narratived into Defensive Player of the Year awards. He's the real deal on that end. For Ja to score as much as he did in that way, super impressive, and a really big part of why the Grizzlies have performed so much better as an offense in the playoffs than in the regular season. I think they're 6th in the playoffs currently, offensive rating, and they're 15th during the regular season. The 10-minute disparity between game 1 and game 2 in Jonas Valanciunas' playing time looms very large. I think he's a plus 18 on the series. The Jazz are really, really good, but with Ja ascending, there is an opportunity, as there often is with young superstars, for them to steal a series that they might not have otherwise gotten. I think the Grizzlies, if they can maximize, polarize their outcomes, their advantages, I actually think that this series is something they can win. It's not going to be easy, and I think it does ride a lot on them really banking on defensive strengths and asking guys to punch above their weight on offense. Maybe you need another Dylan Brooks game that allows the defense to pay more attention to him than they should. If you're paying a lot of attention to Dylan Brooks, that's a very good thing for the Grizzlies, and you hope, Dylan, please don't shoot us out of it. Make the pass. There will be extra creases for really good cutters on the rest of the floor. They run really tight sets. Make the right play. And if you have your shot, take it. That's really important. Jaw, downhill, pick and roll, scoring, super important. The most important thing, though, I think, is defending the Mike Conley, Rudy Gobert pick and roll. Conley, he had 11 assists and 15 assists. He scored 20 in both games, 20 plus in both games. He's been incredible. The Grizzlies have not figured out how to stop that. And a big part of that is Gobert's roll gravity. So how do you stop that? I think what you want to do is don't get fancy with it. Drop. So Jonas Valanciunas, you're not asking him to hedge. You're not asking him to get to the level of the screen. You're not asking for switching. Nothing like that. You don't want him in foul trouble because when Jonas is on the floor, they're winning this series. So when he plays 39 minutes in game 1, of course, albeit no Donovan Mitchell, that's a huge deal. And having him go up against Rudy as opposed to Xavier Tillman or Jaren Jackson Jr., super, super big deal for that team. So drop. Don't pre-switch anything. If Rudy's heading up, don't switch it and send somebody else like a Kyle Anderson to hedge and recover. Don't mess with it. Try and stay away from the fouls. And I think what you want to try to do is make Mike Conley the scorer instead of the guy who's facilitating. He's only scored over 30 once in his playoff career. Ask him to do it a few games in a row. See where that leaves you because you get to try out the experimentation, see what Mike Conley says, see how many shots he's willing to take, and presumably you put Jonas in drop, a very comfortable position, a position where he probably won't foul as much. He'll spend more time on the floor, and you get to see what works against Mike. Is he going to torch you more than he normally would? Perhaps. But you're going to stay in the shell of your defense against a team, the Jazz, who are very good at attacking a moving defense. I think that's something to try. I hope it's something they do, and this episode will come out. Hopefully a lot of people watch it, and then we'll see if what I'm saying is correct in Game 3. But I think that's very, very important. Jonas Valanciunas is a super big deal. I guess the necessary plug has to be made for Caitlin Cooper. I won't bite too much of it, although I wanted to talk about some of this because I wanted to talk about Jonas offensively. She already touched on a bunch of it. It'll be linked. Go check it out. But she's talking about how he's utilized in the dunker spot, why it's important to sell screens, to use small on big screens, and also something I was going to touch on, but she did here. It's really cool that Kyle Anderson, they utilize his strengths in the post and as a passer that might not be utilized on other teams, and that John Morant has also kind of put that in his bag as well, has been really big in utilizing Jonas Valanciunas in this particular play type. Read the piece. She gets into it way more in depth than I do, and it's very much worth your time. One last thing. If Jaren Jackson Jr., and this is what we talked about with the Suns and punching up, Jaren Jackson Jr., if he's out on the floor at the same time as Rudy Gobert, offensively, you have to pop him. Really tantalizing young players who have really unique and wonderful skill sets often go between super underwhelming and super overwhelming. They're constantly going way below an average player because they're not used to the league and they're having trouble applying themselves. And then suddenly they'll get it for a short stretch of time. The floor will open up for them. Their shot making will come along. the pace of the game will come along and they'll really get it. Jackson Jr. really oscillates between those two things. He's swapping. Try and polarize it. Try and get his unique skill set to the top end of what he's doing offensively, because getting him on the roll downhill against Gobert, while you might get a slightly higher floor than you otherwise expected in those minutes, if you are truly maximizing Valanciunas, you want to try and hit your ceiling, and you want to try and motivate and use Jaren Jackson Jr. in a way that you couldn't use any of your other bigs offensively. That's what you have to try and do, because he's not going to be Gorgui Dieng, who they got rid of for whatever reason. He's not going to give you that stable presence. He's going to give you what Jaren Jackson gives you. It's either going to be really good for a moment, for a few possessions, and then you kind of have to hang on the rest of the time. You got to play into that, because he's not going to provide you with that very established veteran floor. You have to swing with those guys. And if you miss, you miss. But there's been plenty of precedents for young players being put in the context. And young players are super talented all the time. Put them in the proper context. See if the vacuum works for them. I mean, Tyler Hero is a good example last year. Now, they're different players, but the point remains the same. If you're Utah, you want to keep producing the same types of looks that you've been able to, because the offense that they're getting has been much more sustainable in the way that they get it than what the Grizzlies are currently doing. The Grizzlies can steal this series, but they need to be really good, better than they would expect to be for a long stretch of play. There's a bunch of things they're juggling at once. For the Jazz to win this series, they basically just have to do what they're expected of, and that's to get downhill, to make really good passes, to attack the second side of the defense, and to find Rudy Gobert when that defense is in motion for a lob or a dunk. And if they have to stick to him and make sure there's no room for him to operate, then you find the guy who's sagging off of his shooter, whether it's Jordan Clarkson, Donovan Mitchell, Ingles, Royce O'Neal, whoever. That's what you have to do. You have to play that type of offense. And, I mean, the Jazz will play that type of offense. For the most part, it's been working for them. Less so with Valanciunas on the floor, because you have to call in less help. You have to sag off less when you know it's him versus Gobert. But I think they've done a fairly good job of trying to stick to their strengths. It's just the Grizzlies have played really well in a lot of areas, and good for them, because the Grizzlies have been, surprisingly, a top-end team. Not league-wide, but they're top-heavy. They're major four guys. They played really well together. They played diligent, great defensive basketball, and they found ways to score that in the past they weren't able to flex as often. Relying on the Utah Jazz to do what they're supposed to do, I think, is the most sensible aspect of this. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Grizzlies are able to steal Game 3 or Game 4 and just keep this series rolling in the ultra-competitive setting that it's been in. This series has been super fun for me.
Yeah, the Jazz, blender, we know what they can do. Number one, for a reason. I think Mike Conley is going to really enjoy playing in Memphis. If you're going to dare him to beat you, I think he can for a game. How much that affects his teammates and how they carry through, that may be a factor, but I agree with you. It's there. It's not as if Game 1 was a complete surprise. If you've watched the Grizzlies at any point in the season, well, not at any point in the season, there have been some rough stretches. If you watch the Grizzlies to close the season and go through those play-in games, you know what they are capable of. They are a team chock full of potential. And to your point, if you have the young guys just blending in, just doing what young players do, expecting them to provide what value first or second or third year players provide, that is not the winning recipe. You either risk it all and do stuff, put Jaren Jackson Jr. in positions where he can detonate, or you go home. It's that simple. We talk about this nonstop. What are you willing to live with? Are you willing to live with Jaren Jackson Jr. going off and, doing whatever he's doing defensively? Because he looks lost. He looks lost. If you're not going to put him in a position to absolutely explode offensively, then having him out there is hurting you. That's my assessment of it. Dillon Brooks, the confidence that he has, he earns every shot he takes with what he does on the other end. Kyle Anderson, shout out to Minute Basketball. Kyle Anderson makes a link below. Kyle Anderson is somebody who I'm also doing a video for, just because Kyle Anderson. A lot of people have messaged me about slow-mo and making a video. His kind of a little bit reminds me of Boris Diaw in his later years. That's so disrespectful to Kyle Anderson's athleticism. I apologize. But Kyle Anderson facilitating from multiple points on the floor, in the post especially. You talked about the post up. And bringing what he brings defensively, these are pieces you have. Every piece you have is solid. Every piece you rely on is solid. But everything else, the players who could be your X factors, you have to push your chips all in and see what you can get out of them. Because if they're not going to explode, you're going to lose. But you got to take some chances sometimes. And there is a path for Memphis to overcome Utah.
Do you have any Conley quips or things you'd like to talk about, since I know you love them?
To your point, forcing him away from being the facilitator means that the ball is in his hands more. And that would be great for Utah normally. But if you take away the other options and make him beat you, then you have a path. Like I said, explosive young players, minimize what Conley is doing as a playmaker, make him score, and the road to the semifinals becomes a little more clear. If it's there, it's there. If it's not, nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Yeah, it's more so about sticking to the strengths of your team. And even though some of those strengths overlap with what Utah does well, changing who you are, there are very few teams who can do that on the fly. And I don't think the Grizzlies are one of them. Not very many teams are equipped. You still have to try and do what you're good at. Try and beat the other team in that context. Two good teams meeting in something they're good at makes for really good basketball. See what the counters are, and see if your young guys see who progresses. It is the benefit of employing a young superstar. What can you give us? How much can you expend? And John Morant, my God, he has plenty to give. And the floor that Slow-Mo, JV, Dillon Brooks provide around that is really strong. And Desmond Bane to some degree as well is also very impressive player. So I think that's mostly what I'm expecting from the Grizzlies Jazz series. And I expect a good game almost every time out. It should be very intriguing.
Yeah. So if you're looking for insights on Blazers Nuggets, we don't have those for you yet. The reason being, there's a lot to cover. So the odds are that Jokic is going to win MVP, and we will be talking about that more and more. But as of right now, if you want my thoughts on the Blazers series, I don't really have very many, because the Blazers can't stop Jokic. The Nuggets can't stop Lillard. And it's about everybody else then. Austin Rivers had a game last night. The Blazers' game plan was very sound. And if Austin Rivers didn't go off, they would have won that game. So it's neck and neck. It's closer than the series record would dictate, but there's not a lot of insight for me. There's not a lot of things for me to glean from that series and share with you. So it wouldn't be fair for me to talk about it. But what I do have are sets. So strap in, because here we go. All right, let's jump in. Game 2, Jazz Grizz. First score of the game. Donovan Mitchell inbounds the ball and goes into overaction. As soon as that happens, Bogdanovic sinks into the paint, and as soon as Mitchell clears, Conley attacks in Spain. Like I said earlier in the episode, Jaren Jackson Jr. looks a little lost here. Mike Conley steps right in for a right-handed layup. Now, we're not going to cut away. Memphis is going to come down in a horn set. Rip screen by Dylan Brooks, and then Dylan actually gets a DHO from Valanciunas. That right away turns into Miami action for slow-mo coming out of the wing. The ball screen is supplemented by a Ja Morant back screen. Slow-mo hangs, hook passes to Ja. Ja kicks it back inside to JV for a tough post score. Then, later in that game, Memphis uncorks Ja with this great Iverson loop set. So Ja is going to Iverson across, and then he comes right off that second big for a lob, attacking all of that empty space. Speaking of Iverson, let's jump to Milwaukee. The Bucks had this beauty of a set to end the third quarter in Game 2. Zipper by Jrue Holiday, and then Giannis is going to swing it to him and then Iverson cut across. Ball is swung back to him, and then he dribbles into the short corner. And as Samson pointed out earlier, shout out to Caitlin Cooper again, Bryn Forbes is going to come sprinting over for an impossibly tough shot. Grenade DHO. Corner fadeaway 3. Tough. Let's stay with Milwaukee. Game 3. Jrue Holiday is bringing the ball down. Bobby Portis sets an away screen for Bryn Forbes, who then ghosts a screen for Jrue. You can see Kendrick Nunn and Iguodala get tangled up for a second, and then Portis sets a ball screen for Holiday. Dedmon is in a drop, so Portis pops. Splash. Since we're talking Miami, how about a little semi-Miami action from Washington? I'll talk about Bowser to Bowser. I'll talk with Bowser to Bowser about this a little bit later, but these sets in the playoffs are weird, and they're designed a little bit weird to shift the defense away from what it would normally do. Here, Russell Westbrook is out on top. He's going to pitch it to Bradley Beal, and then Beal immediately gets a ball screen for Bertans. Pitch to ball screen, Miami. The Sixers don't switch, and you can see Seth going back to recover to his man. Beal is going to cross and attack middle. Bertans goes for a very soft, I don't know what we call it, a Tice seal if it's a post-up on Embiid, but that gives Beal enough time to get to the basket. We won't be talking about Washington for very long, so give the Wizards a little love here. They opened the second half with a Horns flare set. Westbrook is going to come down, Beal on the left elbow, Len on the right. Beal sets a brush screen and then flares off of Len. Russ swings him the ball, and then Brad gets a one dribble pull-up before Embiid can even contest. Since we're on it, we're talking about Brads who won't be in the playoffs for very much longer. Skip to Boston. I'm really proud of that one. Boston Horns clear hammer or Horns clear flare, whatever you want. The Celtics had this sweet set where Smart brings the ball down and Tatum and Rob are on the elbows. They run Tatum off of that Horns clear action. I talked a lot about this in the Suns episode, so you can go back to that if you want it explained. Tatum comes off, and as that's happening, he's going to receive a hammer screen from Kemba as Time Lord sets a ball screen for Marcus Smart. This set works because it has a ton of options, but most importantly, it makes it so that Bruce Brown has to decide if he's coming to tag Rob and leave Fournier or stay home. He decides to stay home. Oop, no clever segues here. Let's just go to Portland. Portland comes out here with what looks like an inverted floppy set, where the two bigs are in horns and the two wings are out top. So Norm and CJ screen for each other and then come off of the bigs in opposite directions. And then Powell opens up at the wing and attacks Austin Rivers off the go and catch. Then this super interesting one from Portland again. They open up the second half of Game 3 with the Spain set. CJ has the ball, Nurk sets a ball screen, and then Dame comes in and sets a step-up screen. I don't need to explain it here. That's the action he's doing. Campazzo is sunk too far in, and Norm gets a catch and shoot triple. So, just some of the sets I wanted to highlight. stuff from game one, I'm sure it's been broken down, so, I stayed away from that. But hopefully you enjoyed that. And
there are some listeners who really appreciate the bouncing around and just throwing like, hey, this is our observations in a short way of this series and this series. And there are some people who came for exactly what you just did right there. I'm one of those people. So thank you for teaching me and allowing me to learn on the fly all the time, and the listener as well. But listener, as we've promised, Hawks-Knicks, there's a deep dive awaiting you. I will not be part of it. It will be Bowser to Bowser with Evin Gualberto, of course, and they're going to get into all of the nitty-gritty of that series, and it'll be after the game that is later tonight. So they're going to do a fantastic job. We're going to plug this into the episode. I can't wait to hear it, and this is kind of what happens with how quickly you have to turn around episodes in the playoffs, because you run the risk of something being kind of old hat very quickly. So we're trying to get it out, and this is what we have to do. Different types of recording processes, and we're getting after it. So thanks for tuning in and listening to me. But some people, the podcast is about to get a whole lot better. So stay tuned for that.
see you soon. Hey, welcome back. For viewers, this has just been a moment, but for me and for Samson, who's currently working on the half of the podcast that we worked on, it's been a couple of hours. I am joined tonight by a very good friend of mine. We talk all the time, Bowser to Bowser, a fellow coach, and the person behind the Basketball Action Dictionary. It's an outstanding resource. I use it constantly, and I cannot recommend it enough. Bowser to Bowser is also a contributor to Peachtree Hoops, and that's why we have him on here today to talk about Hawks-Knicks Game 3. Bowser to Bowser, how are you doing?
I'm great. For a few weeks now, I've been waiting for my moment to be on the Handsome Boys podcast. Now that I don't know who started calling it that.
It was PD Webb.
It was PD Webb? Is he okay. The first guest ever comes on and calls it the Handsome Boy podcast. And so I only get one of the two Handsome Boys. But I'm honored to be here. Loyal listener. I was watching, listening today, whatever I was doing. But thank you for having me on.
Yeah. Super excited for those of you that don't know, and why would you? Because they're my DMs. I message you all the time asking you if that's what you would call this specific play type. So people of the internet, I hate to spoil it for you, but I'm not doing this alone. When I see a play, I have an idea of what it is, but I ask people who, like Bowser to Bowser, do this stuff, name plays, and we figure that stuff out. And so I think this is going to be a super fun conversation. Samson is not around, so it's going to get a little coachy. Sorry in advance, but you're here, so okay. So we're jumping in. What do you think were Atlanta's biggest adjustments from the first two games to Game 3?
The biggest thing I noticed from the first play is that Trae likes to go to his right. He likes to go to his right off ball screens, and he likes to shoot floaters from the right instead of from the left. And New York has been weak in the screen, so forcing him to not use the ball screen to his right. And it's kind of like when you ice a screen, but it not because icing's on the side. But you weak it, force him to go to his left. What Atlanta's been doing is just flipping the screen. They'll just have Capella, instead of setting the screen to the middle, he'll set the screen to the outside. It kind of works, kind of doesn't. Trae can snake back around and he can make a bucket or whatever happens, but it's not an ideal play. So the first play tonight was Ram exits, and it's designed for Trae to go to his left. And I even looked up some clips, and Atlanta has ran this before. I have other Ram exits saved, but they're mostly Trae going to his right. And so it wasn't even that play, because they ran that play 3 times in the first quarter, and the second time they ran the play, and the third time, it was to go in the opposite direction. But subsequent ball screens, even for Bogi, who they also were weakening, were to go to his left. So not to set a screen to go to his right, they weak it, so then they flip the screen and go to his left, but designed to go to their left. And that seemed to be working just a lot better from the start. I feel like Atlanta came out kind of on fire. Making shots definitely makes your offense look better, but be a little bit more open, get the defense a little bit more uncertain about whether they should be tagging or whatever they should be doing. I mean, that's what it looked like from the beginning, that Atlanta had these new adjustments, these new plays, and New York was kind of like, whoa, what do they do? No, that's not what they do. You guys go the other way in the ball screens. And so that was the first thing I noticed, because it happened, first play. And then they even did it on a couple subsequent plays for Bogi, for Trae, because he almost always starts on the left side and he'll get that double drag going to his right. And that's happened so many times. And even at the end of the game one, Atlanta was spamming the Spain pick and roll. They did 4 straight possessions, and they had like 2 threes and a 2 on the first 3 possessions. So they're scoring 8 points on 3 plays. And then they run the same play, but Derrick Rose weaks it. He funnels Trae away from the ball screen. And so Trae kind of improvises and he stakes back around and gets like a decent look at the pull-up jumper on the free throw line. But Derrick Rose recovers and actually blocks the shot. So Atlanta doesn't run Spain for the rest of the game. They go back to the double drag. And then in game 2, I sent you the one clip of, it was Alec Burks doing the sign of stack for Spain pick and roll. It did not work as well when you have the defense saying, hey, they're going to do this play. Then tonight we saw almost no Spain pick and rolls. I think I have like 3, far fewer than game 1 and game 2. But that was the first thing I noticed, was switching the ball screen.
I agree. I think it seems like such a minor adjustment, but
Right.
to have that intentionality of going from Trae is stronger going to his preferred side. He's going left to right. He's better going that way. If New York is going to weak it anyway, why not have the angle so that he's actually attacking that way? Why not game plan this, have us attack in this way, in this very specific way? Because if you work on the shot that the defense is giving you, or if you work on going the direction the defense is forcing you, now you are at the advantage, because it's what you want to be doing. And, Samson and I talk about this quite a bit, is defensively, like, what are you willing to take away? What are you willing to live with? You try and take away Trae's right hand or force him left. If he's going that way and they've planned for that, now you're a little bit more in trouble. Now you start to, so I think it starts to snowball a little bit. You talked about Spain pick and roll and the double drag. Those are, if anybody casually watches the Hawks, Spain pick and roll, double drag, those are their plays. The fact that they went away from their heavy hitters kind of made it so that, we talked about this before we started recording, is now you're kind of taken aback by, okay, so they're not running 77. They're not running Spain. What are they running? And that sort of gets you into trouble, because the Knicks didn't hit their shots, and that'll be largely the discussion. And if the Knicks had just hit a few more shots, obviously they would have been in the game. That's analysis for you. But they didn't, and Atlanta made these very simple adjustments, it felt like. So you and I wanted to talk about Danilo Gallinari and how big of a difference he made to this game. So talk to me a little bit about Gallo and what exactly he did and how he exemplified the game plan for game 3.
So Gallinari is interesting to me because I, like, as much as I wish I were a completely objective person, I have to admit that, like, I have a soft spot for John Collins. John Collins and Cam Reddish, they just have my heart for whatever reason, nothing really logical. But John Collins, is a decent outside shooter. He's a kind of good percentage, but not necessarily the hardest looks. When he's used as just a spot-up shooter, I'm always like, why not just replace him with a better shooter? Like, why not just put Gallo in that place? And that's why I like some of the early plays and some of the later plays as well, where they actually use Collins as a roller. He had the ram exit of the first play of the game. He had the lob in like the third or the fourth quarter, and so they used him as a short roller. Like they were using him, but sometimes the playbook earlier in this season, it was just like, all right, John Collins, now you're going to stand in the corner and spot the floor, which is actually what Dwayne Dedmon did last year. So Collins could be the roller, but now you have Capella. So Capella was a roller and John Collins was a spotter. So it was like, why not just put in Gallinari? And Gallinari, the jokes about him like the worst defender in the league, and he looks like, you know, somebody's dad at the pickup game. You know, like he does all kind of. No, he's got the mohawk. So if your dad has a mohawk, I'm impressed. But he doesn't look awful on Randall sometimes, like on ball defense. He backs up a little bit. He kind of like says like, Randall, I prove it that you were going to do a step back three over me. But Collins on Randall would be a little bit too uptight, and Randall would drive past him. And Gallo got driven past too. It wasn't like only one of them ever got beat by Randall. But if Gallo can contain Randall and then space the floor, those things are huge. But the other thing was, if you're having somebody weak or ice the pick and rolls as the Knicks do, one of the best ways to counter that is to have the big pick and pop. And Gallo is like one of the best pick and pop shooters in the league. And so in game one against a hedge, he was picking and popping and making the shots. In game two, he was missing the shots. And then game three, he's back to making them. And so, you know, you try to ice a side pick and roll, but that leaves Gallo open, and he also has the high shot release. And so even if the Knicks try to do their closeouts, as they do pretty well, and then what's it called, the Jedi mind tricks that the Knicks have been using,
right?
The Jedi mind tricks and their closeouts work not as well if the other guy he's tall and has such a high release and a lot of confidence in his shot. So you bring some on-ball defense, you bring some space on the floor, and you bring some pick and pop threats. Those really take away a lot of what New York wants to do on defense. I remember reading an article by Joe Hulbert and talking about Tibbs' defense and how the emergence of the stretch four kind of nullified a lot of the concepts, and like, who's a better stretch four example than Gallinari? He's like right now in the league, like I can't think of another guy who epitomizes stretch four the same way like Ryan Anderson used to. Like Gallinari is like he's still playing starters minutes mostly in the playoff, despite being like that kind of stretch four who doesn't always move laterally very well. And then also he just gives you something. Atlanta offense, when they had Rondo as the backup point guard and Trae was on the bench, and it was like, all right, no shot has been created. Now what do we do? Even though he missed all of his 2-point field goals, he at least gives you something. You know, give it to him. He'll create a better look than what, you know, Onyeka Okongwu will do under similar circumstances.
Right. Well, one, shout out to Joe. Hi, Joe. A lot to unpack there. Let's start with one. I agree with you. The play that jumps to mind the most. We'll talk about this more when we talk schematics and exactly what Atlanta did to pick apart the Knicks. Specifically, 7:49 in the fourth. DeAndre Hunter is bringing the ball down on the left wing. Gallo goes to set a ball screen. Obi Toppin is on him. Derrick Rose is defending the ball handler. They are looking to ice Hunter. And the simplest solution to that is Gallo just pops. Actually, he doesn't even pop. He just stands in place, and Hunter draws two.
Everyone else moves.
Right, exactly. And then he kicks it back. Gallo hits a three over Derrick Rose. It's just simple stuff like that. You can ice John Collins out of the game. You can ice Clint Capella. That's the Knicks' preferred coverage. Tom Thibodeau, if you've ever heard a single game coached by Tom Thibodeau, you can hear, I'm not going to do the very good Zach Lowe impression of Tibbs screaming ice. I'm not going to do that. I might find a clip, but when you have a pick and pop big, that's the kryptonite of ice, pretty much. We talk about this because we both coach at the high school level. Is if a high school team is icing you, like, what do you do? And we went through a couple of different things. But at the professional level, when you have a certified bucket getter like Danilo Gallinari, just have him pop into space. It's a simple read. If they're committed to ice and they send two to the ball, forcing him one way, that fraction of a second where that pass is open, as long as you have a big who can catch and shoot, they're catching and shooting. And largely that's what Gallo brought to the table today. You pointed this out to me. Gallo was 4 for 4 from deep, but did not convert any 2-point shots, like you said. So Gallo's good at what he's good at.
Yeah. Why I think Atlanta went away from the double drag after doing it pretty successfully in the last couple of games, especially in game one, obviously. But if you are going to, weak instead of ice, obviously a double drag, you have both of those screeners, defenders are there. And so if one of them pops, there's not as much, a different defender can stunt and close out a lot more easily. And also you can have the guy if John Collins is going to pop, his defender can tag Capella and then recover to John Collins pretty well. Because John Collins is a decent shooter, but like he still kind of has a slower windup than Gallinari. And so if you put only one ball screener there, there's not another ball screener defender to stunt and take away that pick and pop.
So yeah, John Collins is actually somebody I wanted to talk about just off the bat because I forgot to mention it earlier. There was I'm using this word a lot today, an intentionality to John Collins and getting him more involved, because if he is a non-factor defensively, and I wish like you am a fan of John Collins, and I can't really explain why. I enjoy John Collins despite all his flaws.
He's not my archetype of player I like at all, but for some reason,
just a soft spot. Yeah. So John Collins is somebody I really enjoy, but he's if you watch the game, he and Julius Randle got into it early. They were jawing back and forth saying oh, I'm guarding you, and Julius Randle says you can't guard me. And yeah, that's right. He in fact cannot guard Julius Randle. But if you are going to have him out on the floor, he better be able to give you something offensively, because he's going to be a non-factor defensively or a minus defense. And there are a bunch of times we message back and forth saying oh, that's a bad Collins X. It's a foul, blown rotation, etc., etc. Ram exit, spread the floor out, was basically able to get him a layup. Now he has made a field goal, and that's it was nothing offensively for the Knicks in game 2. Today, 6 for 11, made some plays in the short roll. You live with that performance. So I think that Nate McMillan going, hey, it's really important that we get something from you. And that kind of juiced them up a little bit. That gave everybody a little bit more. Because if you're relying on your wings and Gallo, I don't necessarily know how good of a game plan that is. And I don't know if Nate McMillan wants to ride or die with that particular style of play.
The thing with Collins is that I think the offense always does better. I think he does better when he gets incorporated early. I think that was smart for Atlanta to give them a touch early on, because I feel like when he gets a bucket early, he has much better games offensively and defensively. But I noticed with the exit of Payton, John Collins didn't get to play his free safety that he did so well in game 1. And I was a little bit, as a Atlanta fan, I kind of want Payton to play a little bit more.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we can talk about that. Is the rotations, that's the big adjustment that Tibbs really made, right? Is you start Gibson and Rose. If anybody out there is listening who's a Knicks fan, okay, I get it. Payton is not the player you want to be playing these minutes. But here's the thing. You can relate this. As a coach, you throw the guys out there that will get your guy. Lineup balance is a big thing, right? When Julius Randle is on the floor, Julius Randle should be the focal point of your offense. RJ Barrett as a secondary option. You have Nerlens Noel as your role guy. You have Reggie Bullock one pass away from Randle all the time, just so when they send that double, he knows to make that very simple pass. Payton is expendable. He's ultimately expendable. That's what you have him in for. You have it so that Derrick Rose doesn't play 38, 39 minutes in a game. Derrick Rose, solid game for him. 30 points on 13 for 21 shooting. Great. But largely, he was just the guy taking shots. He was the guy. You're not really scared of Derrick Rose beating you. And you shouldn't be, I don't think. You take Payton away, and suddenly everything is so much more reliant on Rose. If Rose has it going, that means the ball is out of the hands of Julius Randle. We could talk about why we think he struggled so much in this series, except for the second half of game 2. But I would rather go down with Julius Randle and RJ Barrett trying to do stuff with the ball than I would Derrick Rose.
Yeah, I think Derrick Rose scored 30-some tonight, and I think the next highest score for the Knicks was like 14 or whatever.
Yep.
I think Atlanta's way happier with that combination than if Randall gets his 30 and everyone else gets theirs 14 to 17, whatever it is. So I think it's like, yeah, because Rose, he creates, he makes buckets, he makes tough shots. The way I remember him at Memphis and the way he's able to transform himself has been amazing. Like, he gets a lot of kudos for that, and he's been getting them as he deserves. But he's not a great playmaker, right? Like, that's fair to say, right? The rest of the team can sort of load up, and you're not really worried that he's going to get 31 points and 14 assists. Yeah, I'd rather have Rose beat me than Randall beat me, like, especially because Rose isn't a great shooter, and so he's a better shooter now. You can go under his ball screens every once in a while, and you can take your chances and just kind of roll the dice and hope that he doesn't make enough of them that night.
Right.
Versus Randall, who, if he starts scoring, then I kind of feel like there's a ripple effect of where, because when you see how they load up against Randall, if he's scoring well while the defense is loaded up to the strong side that heavily, something's going wrong. That is more demoralizing than the fact that, like, yeah, a former MVP is getting his 30 points. Like, you kind of live with that in a way.
Exactly. And that's the thing, is the Knicks went with Rose, and that's not a criticism. Like, that's a fine adjustment if that's what you're telling me this was. If it's finally saying, okay, I'm tired of the X amount of minutes Elfrid Payton was getting, and we're just going to take that off the board, fine. But what's the scheme against Trae Young? So today we saw some ice, some weak, some aggressive blitzing, and none of it worked. Or I don't want to say none of it worked. But if Trae Young is getting his 21 and 14 and you're doing everything you can in that situation, things are going very wrong. If you were Tibbs, if you were the Knicks, is there anything you would do differently? Is there anything you would try? I'm not necessarily saying that Tibbs would even try this. For me, my answer would be, hey, let's see if we can, like, box and one him in the style of the Indiana Raptors, as friend of the pod, Caitlin Cooper, calls them. Box and one him, make somebody else beat you. Is there an adjustment you would make if you were Tibbs? And is there an adjustment you would make that's super unrealistic to Tibbs?
Yeah. One is face guard him, get the ball out of his hands, make Kevin Huerter run a spread pick and roll, like, kind of thing like that. The other thing is drop coverage, play 2-on-2 on the ball screens, give up the floaters, and help that the odds are in your favor that night. Because, he's good at the floater, but being good at the floater kind of means you make 40% of them, right? Like, I saw the stats, and I hopefully can remember, but it was like, yeah, he made 40% of his floaters this season. And it's like, yeah, but if you make 40% of your 2-point field goals from any spot, you're not really happy with that result. The drop coverage, he likes his floaters. If you get him going left, it's even better. His prep pick and roll, 2-on-2, stay home on the shooters, which is the opposite of what Tibbs does, right? It's the opposite. And I just kind of feel like with a shot creating playmaker like Trae Young, you saw him tonight on those, the ATO that didn't work. And then he went and found Collins. And then a few plays later, he did the same thing and found Hunter on the kick out three, where essentially he would just draw the defender. Like, he basically would drive knowing the defender's going to come, knowing the pass is going to come. You're doing that kind of proactive processing instead of reactive that Evin was talking about last week.
An earlier episode.
Right. Where I think, like, that's one of the drawbacks, I think, of the Thibault defense, is that kind of the rotations can be a little predictable, or maybe that's to Trae, maybe not to everyone, but you start to see, like, oh, if I do this, I pull out here, he's going to come in, Collins is going to hit the three. Now, you can hope Collins misses the three, Hunter misses those threes, but I don't think hope is a really great strategy. Sometimes it's the only strategy you have. But I'd rather not have to just hope that the people miss open shots.
Right.
But yeah, those are the two things I would do: face guard, and then 2-on-2 on the pick and rolls, and force them into drop coverage, force them into floaters.
Right. So I completely agree with you. If you're face guarding Trae, if there's one thing that has been proven time and again, not just this season, but over the course of his career. And like, you know me, I'm not normally one who like talks the vast majority of somebody's career and the narrative and stuff like that. But as much as people have wanted him to be a more active off-ball player, Trae still has not become that. It's not been a part of his game. So if you can somehow find a way to make him give up the ball and then deny him the ball back, I think that's your recipe for success going forward. Now, we talked about this just casually. I don't think there's anybody equipped on the Knicks to do that. Maybe Frank Ntilikina, but like now you're dusting somebody off the shelf, and you know you never know how that experiment is going to work out.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's a sound strategy, and we'll see if Tibbs experiments and tries anything like that. But that leads us a little bit into the other players on the floor, the secondary playmakers, as it were. So you have Bogdan Bogdanovic and Kevin Huerter, and you wanted to talk a little bit about Kevin Huerter, but as a way to get to that, Samson left me a couple questions to ask you, and the second one is very Samson-y, so I'll hold off on that. But here's one of his. Is Kevin Huerter the underrated man on the Hawks? It seems like he enhances his teammates no matter what he's doing on the floor.
So he reminds me of how I think about Obi Toppin, which we'll talk about later. In short, is he the underrated man? And I think the answer is actually no, because at this point in their careers, this is not a prediction on what's going to happen in the future, but at this point in their careers, it's kind of like everything Kevin Huerter offers you, and he does some great plays offensively and defensively tonight, right? He can make his range has gotten incredible. He got some steals and some blocks, kind of things that you wouldn't really expect. And then I love it every time he gets so excited when he gets one of those fast break transition dunks. He's a great player. It's just that like Bogi offers everything a little bit more, right? And that was one of the things I was worried about in the season. So before the season began, I wrote up a piece on like what Bogi brings to the Hawks, and I was using basketball indexes. I was using their website, and I was looking up like players who had the same profile of Bogi. So it was like whatever label they had, like secondary playmaker that were A's from perimeter shooting, B's or C's, so whatever it was. And the results were that there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 players in the league. Beal and Booker were the best players, but then it was Kennard, Hero, Hield, Huerter, and Bogi. And it was kind of just like, out of the 7 players who fit this archetype, Bogi and Huerter are 2 of them.
Right.
And the reason Bogi is not on the Kings anymore, because they already had 2 of them, Bogi and Hield, and they were like, this is not a sound strategy to have both of these guys going forward. We should get rid of one, and they actually maybe should have gotten rid of him in a different way. I think Huerter is still a lot younger. I mean, Bogi, he's like one of those surprisingly old players if you think about it, because he came as an old rookie.
Right.
So sometimes you can kind of forget that he's like 28. I don't know how old he is right now. And Huerter is still really young, and so like Huerter could get better. But at this point, I don't think like Huerter is the underrated guy. I think if anything, it's sort of DeAndre Hunter, because his injury has sort of quieted expectations from him, as they probably should, right? Because he hasn't like been full speed. But if you are going to predict which Hawk player is going to be the X factor, so who's going to go off in game 4, I think it's more likely to be like a Hunter than a Huerter. Like Huerter is going to give you your 10, your 15 kind of thing, but Hunter might have an off night and go 1 for 9, but he also could go for 28 points in that sense. So I think Kevin Huerter is a great player. I think there's a bit of redundancy with Bogi, and people have been saying this in the beginning of the season. I'm not like being super wise by being the only one who noticed this. And I was even more worried when Bogi wasn't being utilized well. I felt like a lot of what has worked for Bogi could also work for Huerter. Like, don't ask them to run a spread pick and roll, but get them off a pin down, and if the defense switches, then he can attack them with movement, things like that, and actually can use the secondary playmaking as opposed to just like give him the ball the same way you give Trae the ball and ask them to run a spread pick and roll against a set defense. Like that did not work very well. But if you get him in situations where the defense is rotating, he can make the reads. So I like Kevin Huerter, but I wouldn't call him the most underrated at this point. Would you?
So I understand where Samson's coming from because we obviously talk quite a bit. I get his value. I think one of the things that sticks out the most is the game winner Tony Snell had against the Raptors, where Kevin Huerter, made this great cut. And if you watch Kevin Huerter enough, he makes that cut where it seems like it's random action, but it's perfectly timed and it shifts the defense away, or it forces the defense to make uncomfortable decisions. And
do you know who's the other Hawk player who's really good at this improvised off-ball movement?
No.
This whole season, I've had a soft spot for Huerter and Solomon Hill. Because Solomon Hill will throw in like an improvised flare screen, right? Because he played with Miami last year, and I love how Miami would do that. But Kevin Huerter's off-ball cutting has been great, and he made that 45 cut. And Tony Snell lifted, and he's done that. He made that great baseline cut in game 2. He is just kind of smart. Like Bogi's like good coming off of he's good at like non-improv, like if there's a floppy set, if there's a motion strong set, coming off of pin downs. But Kevin Huerter is pretty good at just the improvised cut of I wouldn't be surprised if I found out he played soccer in his youth, because all the soccer players turn basketball guys, all the off-ball guys, they're really good at just knowing that there's too many people over here. We need a person over there, you know? And so Kevin Huerter would do some cuts that are prescribed where it's like a pass to a pick and pop big at the top of the key. The weak side wing will make it the 45 cut. But then sometimes he just makes the improvised cuts, end up making a big difference.
Right. A great way to frame this, in addition to everything you said, is if we jump to 3 minutes, 18 seconds left in the third, you have Bogi in the left corner, and they're running that, as you call it, motion strong. I just call it strong, but it's a double stagger for Bogi on the left side. The ball is on the right slot. So Bogi he comes off the first screen from Gallo, and then he rejects the second screen from Collins, and then just goes to the opposite corner. Now, Kevin Huerter flashes to the ball, and he's going to get a ball screen from John Collins. And that's a way Atlanta can use all four of the players we've talked about so far. You have Gallo as basically your 4 or your 5. Doesn't really matter how you parse that out. You have Bogi and Huerter. One of them has to be the decision maker at that point, but they can also play off of each other in that way. And then ultimately it ended up with Huerter coming off the spread pick and roll, swings it to Bogdanovic, who, and we talked about this, we marveled at his release. He catches it up high, and he doesn't have to dip it. He basically catches it above his head.
The Duncan Robinson shot,
loads and shoots, and he hits a 3 over Alec Burks. And it's that kind of stuff that when you have answers to every question the defense poses, then it starts to become a little easier. And we talked about this. It's basically preying on New York's rotations, rejecting the ball screens. I learned this from a clinic I watched Ryan Pannone give. It's if you reject early and often, that's a good thing, because most pick and roll coverages teams practice are for when you use the screen and not reject it. So Atlanta puts you in these positions where you reject the screen and then you rescreen. Now you have to make a choice. Are we trying to go back to the original coverage? Are we trying to improvise? And Tibbs' defenses, I don't necessarily think it's fair to say that they're not great improvisers, but it's not necessarily something they have to do.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It's like the rotations are kind of scripted almost in a way.
Yep.
And I will say that I should back up and say I think Kevin Huerter is the better proactive passer. And so that play you mentioned is significant because almost always if Atlanta runs motion strong, the stagger, whoever's cutting off of that, if there's nothing there, he will flow into a pick and roll. So there was Bogi cut off that, but they didn't flow into pick and roll for him. They put him over to the weak side. They gave the ball to Kevin Huerter, and he ran the pick and roll with Bogi as the lifter, as a shaker in the weak side corner. So his man was the tag man. So they switched it and ran it to Kevin Huerter. Because Kevin Huerter had that great cross-court pass a couple of days ago. I will say that, like, Bogi would be he's a pretty good reactive playmaker, but Kevin Huerter, for being a non-primary playmaker, he's pretty good at the proactive stuff, at just knowing even before it happens, the tagger is going to tag, and so Bogi's going to be open. And Bogi has that really, really quick release. And so if you play against a Tibbs coach team, you know that they're going to try to stunt and recover, and Bogi's going to shoot before the recovery can get there in time.
Right. So, yeah, it's basically New York making the rotations that they're going to make, and Atlanta saying, no, this is what you're going to have to do to beat us. If you're not going to adjust, this is how we're going to beat you. Just real quick before we transition into something else, it reminds me of 7 minutes left in the second quarter. Lou Williams has the ball, and they're running Bogi off of a double stagger again. Bogi comes off the first, rejects the second, and then Capella screens for Collins, and then Collins comes out and sets a ball screen for Lou. You were the very first one that pointed out Spain Veer to me. What happens here is John Collins sets the ball screen, and then Bogi sets that back screen. Now, New York contains it perfectly, and Capella is just kind of standing in the middle of the floor with nothing to do, while Burks and Gibson and Bullock, they're all swarming, and eventually they're able to force the ball out of bounds. Obviously, it's still Atlanta ball. But that was one of the only times that they ran Spain, and we talked about this earlier, it didn't work. And so when you start to go away from your heavy hitters, the things that teams practice against, now you're in a little bit of trouble.
It's it reminds me of when the first person on your scouting report, the opponent's best player, when he goes off and has 30 points, it's like, all right, he's doing his thing, we know what to do. But when the sixth person on the scouting report does that, it's like, we don't even know how to stop him because we spent all week focusing on the first 5 guys. Like, who is this sixth guy? So when the first plays on the scouting report are beating you, it's like, all right, we're gonna make these adjustments. We knew we might have to. But when the fifth, sixth player are causing the same problems, it's like, all right, we didn't plan this at practice yesterday. Let's come up on the fly with some way to stop a play that we didn't expect was going to come.
Exactly. So that actually ties in perfectly to the second Samson question. It's going to get a little tough because I am not Samson. I don't have the dexterity to be able to work through this question, but he sent it to me and I'm going to read it, and it's going to be a struggle, but I hope you and the viewers enjoy this. It's about number 1 on the Knicks scouting report. Okay. Whew. So as teams have started to absorb cross-court passes much better, what have you made of Trae's ability to coax the tag out of the lane with the threat of it, and how he works the interplay of skip passes and lobs?
So is this against New York or in general?
We'll take it. Let's go New York first, and then if you have an answer for in general, great.
So New York, I think, could be kind of guilty of overplaying. Or overhelping. And so sometimes there was that one play when John Collins made a kick out 3, and there was 2 guys coming into the lane. It's like, we don't need both of them to take away the floater, right? You just need one of them. So if I'm the Knicks, I would help less in certain different ways. I mean, not necessarily universally, but that don't send 2 guys to stop a floater. I think Trae is a good enough proactive playmaker to where it's not like Rondo or Draymond Green. I remember when they would blitz Golden State Warriors, they would blitz Steph Curry off the pick and roll, and Draymond Green would get the short roll, and then he would get the lob, right? And it happens, play after play after play. Force Draymond Green to shoot a floater. Like why are you giving up the lob when you can give up the floater? And so I think for a lot of it's play the numbers game. I think Trae's going to know how to play the odds, and he's really good at setting you up. What he did to Ntilikina, and as Glen Willis pointed out after game 1 for the game winning basket for the floater, It was like he wanted to go right. So he like sets up Ntilikina without Ntilikina even realizing it, and jukes back over to his right. It gets to the spot he wants to get and makes the floater. So I think Trae is still going to be good at it. It's not like a Rondo situation where it's he gets past the first line of defense and then he's going to pass. And so you can kind of just stay home. But Rondo has his floater as well. Yeah, I think it's always like a counter, right? There's the isolation ball, and then there's the Tibbs strong overload, and then there's the stretch 4 hammer screen type thing, and then there's the it's kind of like there's always something else. And so I think that if a team takes away one thing, that means they have to leave up something else. And so they take away the cross-court pass. Trae might have the pull-up jumper. Now maybe you'd rather have him take a pull-up jumper instead of Bogi taking a wide-open kick-out 3. But I think you kind of just play the numbers game and think about what you're willing to live with. I don't think that like there's a fix where it's like, oh, if they did this defensive coverage, Trae would be nullified or anything like that. So I think if that happened and they took away some of those passes, he would find the other passes that might be available. It may not be as good passes, but he would make an adjustment.
Right. Okay. So we've talked adjustments. We've talked a little bit of everything. Our final question before we get out of here is, do you think Hunter and Bogdanovic are still learning how to balance playing with each other? And do you think that balance is improving?
I think definitely, yeah. There was Trae and then there was Hunter, right? Early on in the season. And then Hunter goes injured, and then Bogi kind of becomes the number 2 option. So they're both sort of used to being the second banana. And they're going to be used to play each other. I think what's nice is that they're very different players. And so there's not as much overlap or redundancy with them. Hunter's a bit bigger. He's a bit more physical. He's more of a mid-range guy who can hit the open 3 versus, whatever Bogi's shooting 47% from 3, whatever crazy number he's doing. Yeah, and they haven't played that many games together. I don't know if we have the exact stat, and any teammates who haven't played that many games together aren't going to have the greatest chemistry, but the balance is definitely improving just because I think Hunter, as he gets more confident and more healthy, his chemistry will improve with anybody. Like there's, being better makes you a better teammate, right? There was times when Bogi was screening for Hunter, especially, so there were some floppy plays when Bogi was being top blocked in game 1, and he would come around and he would screen for Hunter, and Hunter missed the kick-out 3 on that point on the right wing. But then later on, you could put either one of them in the back screener Spain role when they were doing the 4 Spains back to back to back. You could get Hunter shots by having him be the back screener, or you could get Bogi the corner 3 while Hunter's also the back screener. And so I think they can create for ways, and they also have enough positional size difference where Hunter can even guard power forwards and Bogi was guarding Derrick Rose. So there's enough spectrum to where they don't have to guard the same people either. So I think offensively and defensively, they fit pretty well together.
All right. So before we get out of here, Bowser and I were both coaches, and the nature of our jobs is such that we feel it would be irresponsible to make predictions. Here's what I can tell you from my perspective. It's been a fun series so far. That's it. Do you have any, not predictions, but pseudo predictions? So do you expect Tibbs to make any significant adjustments? Because as you've noted, Tibbs didn't make that many adjustments today.
Yeah, I think Randall isn't going to shoot 2 for 17 for her. And I think Tibbs is going to make adjustments. He's already made some. Knicks have gotten even more formidable, and I expect more. And I hope Nate McMillan's also making his adjustment. Sometimes you do too much tinkering, but there's always room for improvement somewhere.
Right. Yep. Straight from a coach's mouth. I'm glad it's not just me anymore. It's a shame Samson isn't here for this, but I really enjoyed our conversation. If you have anything to plug, now is the time for it.
If you find me on Twitter, it's Bowser2Bowser, bad guy from Mario. So Bowser2Bowser, and then from Twitter you can find that I have something called the Basketball Action Dictionary, which is like, if you're watching this website and you're like, Spain, what does that mean? Chicago, what does that mean? Miami, like all the different kind of plays, Ram exit. There's a page on the Ram, there's a page on the exit, for instance. There's even a page on Ram, or not a page on that, but there's examples of Ram exit on there. And it's just the resource I always wanted of everything in one place, of like, what do these terms mean? How do they work? How are they defended? Yada, yada, yada. But that's called the Basketball Action Dictionary. That's on Medium. That's probably a lot harder for you to find, but if you just go to my Twitter page,
I'll have the link below.
Okay. Yeah, it's in my bio there. And then also I'm a contributor for Peachtree Hoops, so you might see my name there coming soon. But mostly, if you follow me on Twitter, yeah, I want to give a shout out to all my friends at the Atlanta Hawks subreddit. You guys love to talk basketball, and you love to be funny, which is a great combination. Never change. Keep up the good work. But yes, if you want to see more, Twitter's the best place to go.
Yeah. I cannot recommend the Basketball Action Dictionary enough. If you have ever wondered what I do when I struggle with a definition, the Basketball Action Dictionary is the answer to that question. So, Peachtree Hoops, Basketball Action Dictionary, Bowser to Bowser, handle should be right over there, right underneath. And be on the lookout for the breakdowns, the game threads that you have started to do after Knicks Hawks games. And if the Knicks go through, great. That's fantastic. Selfishly, if the Hawks go through, that means that there will be more reason to bring you on. And yeah, I'd love to have you on again with Samson.
You can, obviously.
Yeah, of course. That's well, maybe no more invite now. Yeah, thank you so much, and we will catch you on the flip side. Bye.